The soft hum of rain brushed against the hospital window, tracing silver lines down the glass. Inside, the faint scent of disinfectant mixed with the warm aroma of chamomile tea that James had brought. For Diep earlier that morning, she sat by the window, wrapped in a light blanket, her eyes lost somewhere in the blur of raindrops and sky. It had been weeks since she was admitted, weeks since her body finally gave in to exhaustion. After months of silently carrying both her pain and pride, James had stayed by her side through every long night, through every trembling breath. But that morning, he had stepped out to handle company matters, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Diep reached for the small vase on the windowsill. The white lilies inside had begun to wilt. She touched one petal gently, her voice barely a whisper. "Even flowers get tired," she murmured. The door opened quietly behind her. Diep turned, expecting to see James, but it wasn't him. Standing there, with a gentle smile and tired eyes, was Mrs. Hyen, James's mother. Her raincoat was still damp from the journey, and a thin strand of gray hair had slipped loose against her cheek. "Good morning, Diep," she said softly. "Did I disturb you?" Diep's heart skipped. She quickly stood, adjusting her blanket. "Oh no, ma'am. Please, come in. You shouldn't have traveled in this weather." Mrs. Hyen walked closer, her steps slow but steady. 200 kilometers isn't much when your child's heart is here," she said with a faint smile. "And when I heard you weren't well, I wanted to see for myself." Diep's hands trembled slightly as she guided her to the chair beside the bed. "I'm really fine now. You didn't have to come all this way." The older woman looked at her kindly. "Let me be the judge of that." For a moment, silence filled the room, only the rain and the soft ticking of the clock. Mrs. Hyen's eyes wandered to the medical charts on the table, the untouched meal tray, and finally, back to Diep's face. "You've lost weight," she said, concern threading her tone. "James told me you've been skipping meals again." Diep lowered her gaze. "I just don't feel hungry sometimes." Mrs. Hyen sighed. "You remind me of someone I once knew, my younger self." Diep looked up, surprised. "Yes," the woman continued. "There was a time I thought being strong meant carrying everything alone. But I learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is to let someone love you." The words lingered in the air. Diep's eyes softened, her throat tightening with emotion. "I don't know if I deserve that kind of love," she whispered. "James deserves someone better, someone without a broken past." Mrs. Hyen leaned forward, her expression tender but firm. "Diep, my son doesn't need perfection. He needs honesty, warmth, and a heart that truly loves him. And you've given him that." Tears burned Diep's eyes, but she blinked them back. "You're too kind to me, ma'am. I've made so many mistakes." Mrs. Hyen reached out and gently took Diep's trembling hand into her own. Her palm was warm, her grip steady, the kind of touch that carried years of understanding and forgiveness. "Listen to me, child," she said softly. "You deserve to be happy." The words broke something inside Diep. Her lips quivered as tears finally fell, one after another. Mrs. Hyen's own eyes glistened, the lines on her face deepening with empathy. In that quiet room, surrounded by the scent of rain and lilies, two women, one who had known the weight of loss and another who had carried the burden of guilt, sat hand in hand. No more barriers, no more doubt. For the first time, Diep felt what it truly meant to be seen not as someone broken, but as someone worthy of love. And for the first time, James's mother wept not out of worry for her son, but out of gratitude because he had found someone whose heart could heal his own. The rain had stopped by the time James returned. The air was soft and cool, carrying the scent of wet earth through the slightly open window. As he pushed the door open, the sight before him made him pause. His mother was sitting beside Diep, their hands still joined. The two women looked fragile yet serene, as if time itself had slowed to honor their silence. A faint trace of tears glimmered on both faces, but there was no sadness in the air, only warmth, deep and quiet. James didn't speak right away. He stood there, frozen in the doorway, his heart twisting at the tenderness of what he saw. It was rare to worlds that he had feared would never meet in peace, now connected by something wordless. Mrs. Hyen turned, sensing his presence. "You're back," she said softly, smiling through her tears. "I hope you don't mind, son." I wanted to speak with her alone. James set the paper bag he was holding on the table. I don't mind, Mom. I just didn't expect. His voice faltered, caught between relief and emotion. You came all this way. I had to, she replied, looking at Diep with affection. Some things a mother must see with her own eyes. Diep quickly wiped her cheeks, embarrassed. I'm sorry, James. I didn't mean to make her worry. But before James could say anything, his mother reached for Diep's hand again and gave it a reassuring squeeze. No, my dear, you didn't make me worry. You made me proud. Diep's eyes widened in disbelief. Mrs. Hyen continued, her tone gentle yet steady. I've watched my son chase success, face failure, and walk through storms. But I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. That's how I know you've given him something I never could. Peace. James's chest tightened. He had imagined this moment so many times, his mother meeting the woman he loved, and yet nothing had prepared him for the emotion of it. That he walked closer, his gaze shifting between the two women. Mom, his voice cracked slightly. Thank you, Mrs. Hyen smiled, though her eyes shimmered with fresh tears. Don't thank me. Just promise me you'll take care of her. Both of you deserve happiness. Life has already been hard enough. Diep lowered her head, unable to speak. Every word the older woman said touched a wound she'd tried to hide for so long. She had been judged before by family, by the world, by herself, but never accepted this completely, this kindly. Ma'am, she whispered. I don't know how to repay your kindness, Mrs. Hyen chuckled softly, her hands still holding Diep's. By smiling again. That's all the repayment I want. At that, James stepped behind Diep and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Then she'll have to smile a lot, he said quietly, because I don't plan on letting her cry anymore. The three of them laughed softly, though their hearts were still trembling. Outside, the last rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, spilling gold into the room. For the first time in a long while, the silence wasn't lonely, it was full of love. Mrs. Hyen stood up slowly, brushing away her tears. I should let you rest, Diep. The doctor will check on you soon. James, make sure she eats. Understood? Yes, Mom, he said with a grin. Before leaving, she turned back once more, her eyes gentle but firm. Remember, Diep, she said, her voice soft as silk, you deserve to be happy. Don't ever forget that. And as she walked down the corridor, her steps light and slow, James and Diep watched her go, both knowing that something precious had just been mended. It wasn't only acceptance. It was the birth of a new kind of family. The hospital room grew quiet after Mrs. Hyen left. The sun had sunk low behind the trees, leaving streaks of amber light across the white walls. The soft hum of the air conditioner filled the silence, blending with the distant echo of footsteps in the hallway. Diep sat still for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of the blanket. She could still feel the warmth of James's mother's hand, steady, kind, and full of something she hadn't felt in years, acceptance. It lingered in her chest like a fragile flame, chasing away the cold that had lived there too long. James moved closer and sat beside her. His eyes were softer than she had ever seen them. She really likes you, he said quietly. Diep looked up, startled. You think so? I know so, he said with a small smile. She cried, Diep. My mother doesn't cry easily. When she said you deserve to be happy, she meant it. Diep's throat tightened. I don't know if I do, she murmured. I've made so many mistakes. Sometimes I feel like I'm a burden to you, to everyone. James shook his head immediately. Don't say that. You're not a burden. You're the reason I've learned what love really means. He reached out and brushed a loose strand of hair from her face. Before I met you, I only knew how to work, how to win. I didn't know how to care, how to stay when things got hard. You taught me that. Tears welled up in Diep's eyes again, but this time they were different, softer, brighter. She tried to smile, but her voice trembled. You shouldn't have to stay here, James. You have work, meetings, a life outside this hospital. James chuckled gently. My life is right here, Diep, where you are. She let out a shaky breath, half a laugh, half a sob. You always know how to say things that make me cry. Then maybe, he said, tilting his head, I should try harder to make you laugh. She laughed through her tears, and the sound seemed to lift the heaviness in the room, the tension, the pain, the fear. It all began to melt away in the warmth between them. James stood and poured a glass of water, handing it to her carefully. "Drink this. You need to stay hydrated, or Mom will yell at me." Diep smiled faintly. "She really cares about you." "She cares about us," he corrected. "And she's right. You deserve to be happy. You both do." There was a pause, long enough for Diep to feel the weight of his words settle deep inside her heart. "James," she said softly, "do you ever think happiness can last? After everything, after all the pain?" He looked at her for a long moment, then reached for her hand. "Yes, because happiness isn't about what lasts forever. It's about moments like this, the ones we hold on to even when everything else fades." Her eyes met his, and in that quiet gaze, she saw something she hadn't dared to believe in for a long time: hope. Outside, the rain began again, gentle and light against the window pane. But inside that small hospital room, it felt like the world had finally stopped storming. James leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "When you're ready, Diep, we'll go home. Not to the old house, but to a place where you can breathe again, a place that feels like peace." Diep nodded slowly, her heart trembling. "Home," she repeated, as if tasting the word for the first time. And as she looked at him, her tears fell once more, not from pain, but from something far deeper. For the first time, Diep believed that maybe, just maybe, she really did deserve to be happy. The morning light was soft and golden when Diep was finally discharged. The air outside the hospital carried the gentle scent of blooming jasmine, and for the first time in weeks, she could feel the warmth of the sun on her skin. James held her hand as they walked slowly toward the car. Each step felt like a quiet victory, a step away from pain, and a step toward something new. Near the entrance stood Mrs. Hyen, waiting patiently. She smiled when she saw them, her eyes glistening in the sunlight. "You look much better now, my dear," she said, opening her arms. Diep hesitated only for a second before stepping into the embrace. It felt natural, like coming home. "Thank you for everything," she whispered. Mrs. Hyen held her tightly, her voice soft but trembling. "You don't need to thank me, child. You've suffered enough. Now it's time to live for yourself and for the people who love you." When she pulled back, a tear slid down her wrinkled cheek. Diep gently wiped it away, her heart swelling with emotion. James stood beside them, watching silently the two most important women in his life, bound not by blood, but by understanding. His mother turned to him and smiled through her tears. "Take care of her, James. Don't let her carry the world alone anymore." "I won't, Mom," he promised, his voice firm, yet tender. "I'll make sure she never feels alone again." Mrs. Hyen nodded and reached out, placing Diep's hand in her son's. "You deserve to be happy," she said again, her words steady but full of love. "Both of you." As they drove away, Mrs. Hyen stood at the hospital gate, waving until the car disappeared down the road. The morning breeze caught her tears, but she didn't wipe them this time. They were not tears of sorrow, they were tears of peace. Because at that moment, she knew her son had found not just love, but a reason to live deeply and gently. And Diep, for the first time in a long time, smiled, truly smiled, as the city lights faded behind them and the road stretched ahead, wide and full of promise. It wasn't just the end of an illness, it was the beginning of healing, of love, of family, of the simple, sacred right to be happy.